Hi, I'm international publicist Michelle Tennant Nicholson, and this is my pet project, how to be a precinctleader.org. And I've been researching in my new role as vice chair of East Flat Rock in Henderson County, North Carolina, how to be a powerful precinct leader. And in my local party, I found a jewel, and his name is Karl Silverman, and he has tremendous experience and has agreed to be interviewed by me today. And because of technology purposes, he's going to be a green phone. So, Karl, welcome, and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, it's good to be here. Thank you. I've been in politics since 1960, but I haven't been really active until the 90s when I became very active in the Democratic Party. Everything from working with the state chairs down to local precinct chairs. The thing that I like to do most is to train precinct chairs because they're probably the most important person in all of the Democratic Party.
Thank you so much. That's why I became one in 2017. I had been inspired by Our Revolution, and I was sitting in some type of event they had in Asheville, North Carolina, and then I really heard for the very first time the importance of precinct leadership and decided that's what I'm going to do. And that's what I did. And I quickly found out that while that intention is admirable, the feet on the ground, when we do have limited time and resources, you need a little bit of guidance. So what are some best practices, Karl?
Well, before we get into best practices, I wanted to talk about the precinct just a little bit so that people understand what a precinct really is. It's the smallest political subdivision that exists only to facilitate elections at the local level. And here in North Carolina, the state law sets the maximum number of registered voters that can be in any precinct based on the county's population, and then the borders of that precinct are determined by the County Board of Elections. And it's where elections are won and lost. It's at the precinct level. I think everybody remembers well, not everybody if you're young, the Kennedy election. He
right,
won.
I'm like, I don't remember that.
Okay.
That's awesome.
For we senior citizens, Kennedy won nationally by one vote per precinct across the country.
Wow, I didn't know that. I did not know that.
One vote per precinct across so precincts are extremely important. Now, the Democratic Party has some disadvantages, and it comes from an old political saying. It's Republicans drive by a school every Tuesday just in case there's an election, and Democrats have to be dragged to the polls. And that's probably because Democrats are more, social animals and emotionally driven, as opposed to the other side. And I won't say anything other than they're fear-driven, as to not really say anything disparaging. So in reality, precinct chairs and the precinct officers and people working in the precinct need to contact their fellow Democrats probably at least 3 times a year. Otherwise, they fade away from being active with the party. So it's always helpful for the precinct team, the precinct chair, vice chair, secretary, treasurer, and the phone team to maintain contact with everybody in their precinct.
Yeah, it's one thing that we took on last year. As I started to understand, I was like, oh, it's just reaching out and calling people. That's what I do for a living as a publicist, no big deal. And as soon as we get off of this interview, actually, Karl, so I'm going to go back to calling. Right now we're doing a campaign in the Bay Area in San Francisco. So no big deal to me making phone calls, not so great for other people. They don't like the gift of gab. My experience has been that people in our precinct really like to hear from other Democrats. And I just also want to say, if you're a Republican watching this, good for you. That's fine. It's because it's basic information on organizing yourself for your political voice. And I know that this information is public, so I'm fine with just getting it out there so that we all can be empowered. So what are some things that we should definitely be integrating into our leadership, Karl, from your experience?
Well, the most critical thing is for a precinct to actually have people willing to do the work. And as I mentioned a little bit ago, it's good to have precinct officers, precinct chair, vice chair, secretary, treasurer, and a phone team. But even if you don't have that, it's wonderful when people get together in the precinct and do it on their own. They're not official, but it's still very important that they do it. And they need to understand how the party works, and they should be in contact with the party leadership so that they're not doing anything that kind of works themselves backwards. And the best way to start is to get a map of the precinct from the party headquarters or from one of the officers, and then drive around the precinct and try to get a feel for what's there. The precinct team can also get a list of all of the active Democrats and unaffiliateds that vote our way, and that's the basis for getting the precinct better organized.
What we did is, one of the things that we did just to kind of drill it home was a list of active Democrats and unaffiliated, but also, the Board of Elections can give that to you. Your party can give that to you. The Democrats have a system called Vote Builder. All of these were very helpful, and I just called that list, and I just want to make sure that you know that as in you, the people listening, they were really open, and I just identified myself as vice chair of the precinct. Hey, I'm your neighbor, and this is what we're trying to do, is just connect Democrats. And that was it, and just listen to what they had to say, listen to what was important to them, let them get their political concerns out so that I would then have a way to actually interact with them. Some of them just felt alone and just wanted to talk to somebody, so that was really nice and surprising. So I want to really give a shout out for phone calls. I know that our team, when we first sent out emails and mail and also phone calls to set up a precinct meeting. And we're one of the poorest performing precincts I've found out in past elections. But we actually had people show up at our meetings willing to canvass, willing to phone, and we've just stayed in contact with them. So I'm pretty excited about that. What would you do if people weren't showing up? What I learned was people who are strong voters in every single election might be low-hanging fruit to be volunteers and canvassers and phoners, whereas people who are maybe drop-off Democrats or people who aren't always voting in midterms, those might be just a great target during the midterms to get them to actually even vote. So in terms of priority order on how to outreach, do you have any suggestions for that?
Oh, absolutely. The lists you were talking about from Vote Builder are accessible to all precinct chairs and precinct teams through the party, and there are designated people across the county that will generate those. And as you were saying, the best thing to do is, the term I like to use is calling friendlies. And those are the people that vote in all of the elections every year. They show up. You don't have to contact them very often. They know who to vote for. But it's always helpful to stay in touch with them. And they're your best target for looking for volunteers to doing the canvassing and the phone calling and the letter writing. And as you were talking about the drop-offs, people may not understand the term. What I like to do, I have a different term that I use, and there's the frequent voters, and then you have the occasional voters, the infrequent voters, and then the non-voter or new registrant. And the frequent voters are the ones who show up all the time. And if you just give them a list of who they should vote for, they show up. And those are the ones that will do most of the work for the precinct. The next tier down is the occasional voter, and they vote typically in presidential elections, on and off in midterms. And so that's your next level. The infrequent voter is the person who just occasionally shows up and votes for whatever reason. And obviously the non-voter, that's self-identified. Those are the hardest to get to the polls. And when you talk about resources and money for the party and for the precinct, there's what they call the rule of 10. It takes 10 times as much resources and money to get an occasional voter to vote frequently, and then the same thing for an infrequent voter to get them 10 times more to get them to become frequent. So your resources should be held to contact those that you have the best chance of turning out, and that is that next level down. And so in your phone list, you'll have these people. So you use your frequent voter to form your team to make the phone calls and write the letters and send the emails to the occasional and infrequent voters, and that's how you increase your voter turnout.
But we don't, so then what's the priority on the new voters? Where would they fall inside that priority?
That's a very interesting thing, is because people who are newly registered or don't vote at all, typically if somebody doesn't vote at all, the amount of resources, time, and money that it takes to get them to vote is beyond reach usually. The Democratic Party, as everybody knows, is typically underfunded. Now with a new registrant, it's best to contact them immediately. So you're talking about best practices, the precinct team should be checking with the leadership of the party, getting the lists of everybody who's registered in their precinct in the last year, and contacting them with a phone call and or a letter, and welcoming them to the community and getting them to be, recognize that they're important by doing that, and you have the best chance of having them vote. And
that's nice. I really like when I moved to East Flat Rock in 2004, and if I had gotten a letter like that, that would have been super exciting to me. And I do like that very much, Karl. And I think that that's something that has not been happening in our precinct that we could easily do. I think that that's something. And I remember some of the phone calls that I had with that Board of Election list, and one woman identified herself as a brand new voter. She was on my list to call, and she lived with a Republican, and she felt really isolated, and she just couldn't even believe that that there was actually Democrats in the area, since we're primarily a red area. Anything about that from your experience of looking at, what's even the point of it, Karl? We're all red anyway in this area. Why would we even try to go for a blue wave? What about that type of a comment?
That we hear that all the time, and we hear that across the country, where if you're not in a left-leaning area, that they think all is lost. It doesn't make any difference. I'm not going to vote. And that's just the farthest from the truth than it can be. And the reason, for instance, here in Henderson County, we're outnumbered 2-1, basically. And people say, well, we can't win, we're never going to elect, the sheriff. And that may be true for maybe, a couple of years now, until we build ourselves up and become better organized. But if you think about it, most of the elections that are very important cover a larger area than just Henderson County. For instance, if we have a state senator running, if we can get votes for that state senator, more votes here than they would normally get with our normally not so good turnout, if we could turn out more people, we can cut the margin for them so that they don't have to get as many votes someplace else. And that's especially true when it comes to statewide elections for the governor or U.S. Senate. If we can get some votes here that they normally wouldn't get by turning out more of our people, then it makes it easier for them to win statewide. And we know how critical that is. We look at our legislature right now, and getting the vote turned out is ultra important.
Well, I really wish you would have been on the date with when I was dating my husband, because I actually live with a non-voter. It was so distasteful to me when we were dating. I remember saying at the dinner, I said, "What do you mean you don't vote?" And he said, "I just don't vote." And I said, "I've got to really think about whether this date is over." And he just looked at me. I'm a pretty straight shooter. Had I had that, because he went into the Electoral College, which, as we know, in the most recent, the past, with Bush and with Trump, the Electoral College, we had some lame ducks on our hands because the majority voted one way and then the Electoral College voted another way. But that was his reasoning inside our date, the reason why he was a non-voter. But if I had had that argument, what you just said about cutting the margin, because the other thing is I have a lot of people who live elsewhere, and they're like, "Oh, you live in North Carolina. Why are you even trying?" Good luck with that. So I love anything else like that. So some good fodder for the banter that I have in my marriage, Karl, or with my friends abroad.
I'm not really going to do marriage counseling, but I would say that for everybody who thinks about voting, it is so important that you vote, because when you don't vote, the other side, their vote counts twice then. And so it's important. But at the precinct level, if the precinct team can maintain contact with, the Democratic leaning folks or progressive folks in their precinct, we have a much better chance of having them turn out. And this is especially true in non-election years, the odd number years. And then when you get to the even number years, it becomes so much more critically important, because if we can keep in contact with these folks, they understand that we think they're important. And Democrats being emotionally targeted is very important to their well-being. They feel like you were just saying, I've been to many fairs and parades and stuff, and people come up and say, I thought I was the only Democrat in this neighborhood. And it turns out that they find out there's, 60 of us, and they're all there, and they stop and break bread with us, and it's wonderful. And so by keeping in contact with these people, when it comes to election year, then when you start saying, okay, we need you to turn out, we need you to make phone calls, you have a much better chance of that happening.
What about phone versus mail versus canvassing? In an interest of time, like the priority in how we're actually communicating, do you think it makes a difference?
Well, with new technology, I would say that if the Democratic Party could start pushing itself into texting and tweeting and Instagramming and all the other technology, that would be wonderful, because so many people don't answer the phone, won't look at the mail, don't like phone calls, especially the robocalls. However, it's still a proven fact that works. Phone calls, emails, texts, all of these things combined would be very helpful in getting our people out to vote.
I agree. Hence the reason why we're doing this YouTube channel on, how to be a precinctleader.org, because I really felt like we should use technology to conserve the leadership training. There's all these trainings that happen all the time, and not everybody can make it. So then people who are at the top level of each of these Democratic parties are having to do trainings over and over and over again, when we could just videotape it and then there it is, and then let's broadcast it to everybody. So just in closing now, is there anything that we should be doing with the candidates in particular? There's a lot of conversation, I think, that confuses precinct leadership, and are we staff for the candidates, or just getting the vote out? Say a little bit about how to prioritize ourselves when we're actually speaking to a candidate, because I've seen some emails where the candidates really think that the precinct leadership works for them. What do you think about that?
I would like to say that the candidates have their own team, and therefore they're the ones that would, knocking on doors and sending the letters and everything. But like many places in the country, our candidates are typically underfunded. And while the precinct team is not dedicated to any one candidate, the team should be dedicated to turning out the vote in their precinct, which will help all of our candidates.
I agree. And I think that it was really like a great tool to use, is because I think back to my days of not really participating at a leadership level and just being a straight line Democratic voter, right? I think that especially for those that aren't, I'd like to, how can we get succinct information from the candidates directly from them? Now with technology, we can actually videotape them and then broadcast what they're saying to the precinct. So thinking of like really unique ways, like I had some people that were up in the primaries come to our meetings, and I just quickly taped what they were saying to the people at the precinct meeting. And I looked the other day at the, it's just a small YouTube channel, right? And I think one of the candidates had close to 400 views. If you think about 400 views in a county, that's a pretty good viewing, right? And they're listening to the entire thing that the candidate is saying. So also really maximizing and leveraging the time of these candidates. They go to so many picnics and events, and it's exhausting for them. So how can we support them as precinct chairs in helping them get their message to the people that are in our precinct? That's what I'm most committed to. I invited all of our local candidates that we support this year to do a YouTube video. I think I've heard from 2. So we shall see who's actually technically savvy and moving forward in that direction. I'm really committed to help get the vote out and get their information out.
I can tell you one thing. I know that Sam Edney has a great video that's online on YouTube I know that Stacy Caskey is in the process of making one. So is Norm Bossert. And I think even Pat Shealy, I believe, running for county commissioner, is working on raising funds to do a YouTube video. So I think what you're thinking about is being able to send this electronically, and then people don't have to try to find these candidates to talk to them and see what they have to hear, is an excellent idea.
Well, if they put something up on YouTube, I'm happy to actually rebroadcast it here. I'd like to see, rather than a polished YouTube video or maybe like an advertisement, I'd actually like to, like we're talking, right? And I did do that with Pat Shealy, for example. She actually showed up one of our meetings, and I actually have, if you go to howtobeaprecinctleader.org and scroll down, you're going to see a few places where I captured them live. And Pat was actually at our meeting along with her competitor, Michelle Antalik. And then Pat was actually chosen in the primaries. But I was really surprised at the viewership of these videos, even the small ones that I only promoted to our precinct area, which I thought was really interesting. But that's great. I'm going to look up our other candidates, and that's a good idea. If they have something on YouTube, then I can click it into the playlist that I have here, share that with the leadership body too, trying to empower them, and then also the select. So what we typically do inside our newsletters with the Democratic Party is we send everybody to their website. But the thing that was always missing for me before I was a precinct leader was that who are they as a person, and do I resonate with them as a person? Which you can only really gather that if you've seen them talk live, right? So I love the fact that we have Facebook Live and that we have all this technology where we can capture them at events and then broadcast that wide for our precinct. Do you think that the precinct should have their own social media or tap into the party's social media? Do you have a quick, as we close on that one?
Yeah, we as a team should tap into everything available to us. I know in my precinct, they're developing a Facebook page. We have an email list that we maintain. I think they're going to try to be doing text messaging as well. So any bit of technology you can use, especially the new stuff for the millennials and such can use, is a great thing. So I would say use all of it. And especially emails right now seem to work better than phone calls and postage.
Okay, so you would agree to have, so at a precinct level, having those owned assets. As a publicist, I call them earned, owned, and paid assets. So all social media channels would be considered an owned asset. And so you would recommend for precinct leaders to have, even at that smaller level, rather than tap into the county's broad size. Okay.
Absolutely. Considering that it's free, like for Facebook, there's nothing wrong with just setting up a small Facebook page and putting your events and posting pictures and keeping people involved, because it's very important to keep liberally minded people involved.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for spending time with me today and agreeing to be interviewed. And I so appreciate you sharing your expertise. And if you think about any more trainings that you think that we should get out to precinct leaders, let me know. And I really appreciate what you're doing and who you've been for the Democratic Party all these years and for standing for democratic ideals. Thanks, Karl.
My pleasure.
Okay.